CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Liberia's presidential elections have been brought to an indefinite halt by its Supreme Court earlier this week amidst allegations of potential electoral fraud. And as the African Union and the regional body ECOWAS swing in to quell the political tension in Liberia, the country's 4.6 million people remain pensive on a fresh election date, which they hope will usher in an era of continued progress in employment, infrastructure and energy. So as Africa's oldest republic makes efforts to see through a peaceful democratic transition, the first in 70 years, how will the 2017 elections impact on Liberia's future development? And with a complicated electoral impasse, how will the West African nation move beyond its current political crisis? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, Liberians were to head to a second-round election runoff this week, but its Supreme Court has now postponed the elections indefinitely, saying the runoff will not hold until Liberia's Electoral Commission has investigated claims of electoral fraud. Let's take a look at events that have led to the current standoff.
With Liberia's first democratically elected president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, set to leave office at the end of 2 successful terms, more than 2 million Liberians went to the polls last month to pick a new leader. President Sirleaf, the first female president in Africa and the first democratically elected president of Liberia since 1944 to voluntarily hand over power, leaves behind a legacy of democracy and lasting peace, winning a Nobel Peace Prize along the way. And these are rather large shoes to fill. And perhaps it is this deeply ingrained democratic foundation during her 12-year tenure that resulted in 20 presidential candidates competing to succeed her in the general elections held on October 10th. But the elections resulted in a runoff between former soccer star George Weah and current Vice President Joseph Boakai, the former garnering 38.4% of the votes and the latter 28.8%. Neither candidate was able to garner the 50% majority of votes required to take office in the first round. Meanwhile, just 3 days after Election Day, Charles Brumskine, who finished 3rd in the first voting round, challenged the general election based on allegations of electoral fraud. Brumskine and his Liberty Party subsequently filed a complaint with the National Elections Commission, and then proceeded to file a writ of prohibition with the Supreme Court to put a stay order on any and all actions with respect to the presidential runoff, originally scheduled for November 7th. On Friday, November 3rd, the Supreme Court listened to arguments between the Liberty Party and the National Elections Commission and ruled on November 6th that the Elections Commission must indefinitely postpone holding the runoff election until it has fully investigated the fraud claims of the Liberty Party. And that's where things stand now on Liberia's presidential elections. The nation, and indeed the world, anxiously await the National Elections Commission's conclusory findings.
And to unfold the ensuing political impasse in Liberia, I'm joined in studio by CGTN's Robert Nagila, who extensively covered the first round of voting from Monrovia. Robert, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Now, this is the first peaceful transition of power in Liberia. Just how significant has this election been for Liberia?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Beatrice, it is significant for a couple of reasons. One, as you've mentioned, first peaceful democratic transition of power since that devastating civil war that ravaged that country 14 years back. And second, but perhaps more important, this was the first election that was conducted by the Liberian Election Commission. All the previous ones had been conducted by the United Nations. So this was a coming of age, sort of, you could put it like that. So significant in those 2 terms. But also, as any election, really, there were some challenges, of course. I spoke to a lot of the observers, and they said that the process itself had gone without much problem. But yes, there were challenges. For example, some people could not find their names on the voter registration. Sometimes the lines were too long and confusing. Nobody knew which streams to go to. But as the observers said, when these challenges came before the Electoral Commission, they were sorted almost immediately. So congratulations to them for playing that role. But in terms of how the process carried out, from what we witnessed, everybody that we spoke to appeared happy with the fact that they were able to exercise their democratic right and that the process had gone smoothly, apart from niggling challenges here and there.
Let's talk about the intrigues in this election. It's quite drama-filled. Oh,
yeah, absolutely. And you could write a book on this and it would definitely become a bestseller. On the one side, you've got President Sirleaf and her Vice President Joseph Boakai, who is also a candidate in this presidential runoff. Now, incidentally, the two of them are not on talking terms at this particular moment. In fact, during the campaigns, Boakai's supporters were chanting, "What Sirleaf break, Boakai fix." So blaming her for a lot of the problems, basically trying to distance Joseph Boakai from Sirleaf. But let's not forget that Sirleaf was very, very important. She was more of a bridge, bringing stability, peace, and rejuvenating that economy to start growing after the Civil War. So her legacy appears intact for now, but of course there were other challenges. Corruption, for example, the economy could do much better, but she is considered the bridge between that Civil War period and this relative period of stability as well. And then on the other hand, you have George Weah, who's running for the third time. Now, what's interesting about George Weah is his choice for vice presidential candidate, and it happens to be Jewel Taylor, the wife of the warlord Charles Taylor, who's currently serving, I believe, a 50-year term in a British jail.
And that's what I was going to ask you, Robert. Yeah, what's the significance of that, though, and what does it imply, though, for Liberia's stability, Liberia's security, Liberia's fragile peace?
Well, Beatrice, first of all, that's a really good question, because in the run-up to the election, there have been a lot of concerns about violence during that electoral period. And we witnessed peace messages throughout, peace activities by everybody from small children all the way to grown-ups as well. So they were taking this very, very seriously. And the police as well were confident that they had deployed adequate security measures around the country and around the polling stations to ensure that the process went smoothly. A lot of international partners, Liberia's international partners from China, the EU, and everybody else has called for calm and peace and let the process carry itself out. One of the largest finances of this election is the EU. So perhaps that also helps in keeping a leash over this, plus the other international partners. But the threat of violence is never far away. When it comes to George Weah, I think after the last two presidential elections that he ran and did not make it as the president, he's now trying to consolidate his support base. And what better way to do that than bring on board Charles Taylor's support base? Because he still has, despite the fact that he's a convicted warlord serving a huge jail term in a British prison, he still has a huge support in Liberia, so that cannot be discarded. And what Taylor, it appears, wanted to do was to bring that support base on board, so that combine it with his own support base. And what better way to do it than by bringing on board Charles Taylor's wife, Jewel? In fact, what's interesting is Charles Taylor, from prison, we believe, actually addressed a rally, a Liberian rally, and telling his supporters to back George Weah. Not only that, but you look at the ex-combatants as well that we interviewed, and they all seem to back George Weah because they believe that he is the one that will actually be all-inclusive, bring the whole country together, unite them, and then job creation as well. How he intends to do that at the moment, we still haven't got a detailed look at his economic plans, because they simply not put them out there yet.
Right. The Supreme Court ruling, though, quite interesting, because that petition was brought about by the person, Charles Brumskine, who actually came third in this election, was not supposed to be in the runoff.
And this is the interesting bit about that challenge by Charles Brumskine, because, as you rightly put it, he came third with about 9% of the vote. So he was nowhere near there. However, he went to the Supreme Court and alleged that in his petition, he alleged that there were, the Electoral Commission committed fraud and irregularities. And he also wanted the court to do away with the current electoral commissioners, and so that it can be reconstituted afresh before the presidential rerun was held. But the Supreme Court basically said that it could not rule on this issue and threw it back to the Electoral Commission, saying that the Electoral Commission should investigate the fraud and irregularities first, before they can decide on how the process can move forward. Now, Mr. Brumskine basically says that, yes, we believe that Sirleaf should take some responsibility. However, that beat is not in their complaint at all. So they're simply moving forward with fraud and irregularities.
All right, Robert Negila, thank you very much for your insight on Liberia. Well, we're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have more expert analysis on the developing situation in Liberia. Just stay tuned.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. And to further expound on Liberia's elections and its implications on the country's future, I'm now joined from Johannesburg by Lizol Lo Vodran, an African analyst and senior research consultant for the Peace and Security Research Program from the Institute for Security Studies. In Lagos, Fisayo Alo, senior researcher at the Good Governance Africa, and with me in studio, Professor Macharia Munene, an international relations expert at the USIU here in Nairobi. To you all, thank you very much for joining us here on Talk Africa. Let me start off with you, Lizol, in Johannesburg. Now, Liberia has had a peaceful presidential election, but that election, the rerun, has been put off indefinitely following allegations of fraud. This was said to be Liberia's first democratic transition since the Civil War. First, what are your perceptions and your views on Liberia's elections? Any surprises there?
Yes, I think everybody's looking at what is happening in Liberia with concern, given the background and the high expectations of these elections. The fact that the Supreme Court has now intervened and has ordered that the National Electoral Commission should hear the petitions about fraud during the vote is a good thing in that sense, that we are turning towards the institutions and the judiciary to solve crises rather than taking to the streets. Of course, this comes just after what happened in Kenya as well, where the Supreme Court called for a rerun. So I think in that context, it's extremely important for us to see, you know, a quick solution also, that the Electoral Commission will now hear those petitions and that a second round will take place as soon as possible.
Right, we'll come to that second round in a minute. Fisayo Alo, you're watching this, of course, from Lagos. ECOWAS has been a major partner for Liberia, particularly during its civil wars. What's your thought?
Well, I think more than ever before, Liberians would really appreciate the fact that, look, they need the peace, and so they will do everything within their powers to ensure that this is resolved peacefully, without any resolve into conflict whatsoever. I think the Supreme Court has done well because unlike the Kenyan elections, it has not annulled it, but has said, look, fix all the irregularities and then fix all the faults, and then they can go on. So more than ever before, I think they stand a good chance to correct and ensure that they get it right, even as they go on to the rerun at a date, as soon as, you know, that date is fixed for, you know, the rerun.
Professor Macharia Munene.
Well, I think the decision in Liberia is interesting. For one, it was not about annulling the election. It was a third candidate complaining that he might have got more votes that were announced. And therefore, probably, he should be in the runoff instead of the two people that were on the runoff. And the court listened to him that if there is such a thing, maybe it should be looked at. And I think that's what the court had said to the commission, look at this thing again, just to verify, to ensure that you've got your figures right, as opposed to saying this is what you have. And to make the matter a little more interesting, the court did not give timelines. It should have said, do this by this time, so that you have some sort of finality towards the whole thing. The idea of cross-checking is good, but it was not an issue of annulling or not annulling. It was a question of someone saying, maybe I should have been included in this runoff instead of something else.
Right. Lizzle, let me just come back to you because a few issues coming out from the panelists here. And one is the idea that more and more, perhaps, African countries are starting to look at their courts as a, during the electoral processes. Is this a trend that is coming now? Is this a positive trend? What's going on here?
Yes, it looks like a positive trend, definitely. It is all about the independence of the judiciary, of course, and the trust that ordinary citizens have in the judgment of the courts, and then also the Electoral Commission. As I said earlier, I think it is important that people are putting their trust and their faith in these institutions. But it is very tricky, and we are dealing with high stakes. These elections are all taking place with strong contenders vying for position, and we have a background of how things can go seriously wrong. I was thinking of Cote d'Ivoire at the end of 2010. People will remember that the Electoral Commission then at the time, decided that Alassane Ouattara had won those elections. The Constitutional Court ruled otherwise. In the end, it was the Electoral Commission that won the day because there was such lack of faith in the institutions themselves. So what will have to happen is that with each election going forward, the institutions fine-tune and show citizens that they are actually trustworthy and completely impartial and independent.
Professor Macharia, there have been parallels, though, drawn between Kenya and Liberia following, the electoral processes of the two countries. But how fragile now is Liberia?
Liberia is fragile just in case some things are done wrong. Right now, it appears as if George Weah is slated for victory. And there have been arguments that some of the things being done are essentially to stop George Weah, as opposed to saying that there were irregularities or some anomalies here and there. If the impression is created that all these court drama, because it's just court drama, is meant to stop George Weah from becoming president of Liberia, then they have a major problem. If it is fixing some technicalities, it's okay, and the courts should be there to help. As I pointed out, I think the court in Liberia made a mistake in not putting a timeline, say do this, by this, by this, by this, and get the country moving. But the impression somehow being created in some circles is that there is a scheme somewhere to derail George Weah.
Fisayo, is there an instability situation here to look at in terms of the choice of running mate for George Weah?
Well, if I get you right, I think the Sierra Leonean government will be very, very careful in ensuring that this is handled well, because they wouldn't even want, any humanitarian crisis to spill over, because any problem in Liberia is actually going to affect that country. So I think that it is important that the process is allowed to take its course, and from the meeting that they had with the AU and ECOWAS helmsmen, they have committed to peace, that they will allow the NEC to get its acts together and then also go to the courts if there's any problem eventually. So I think that Sierra Leone is really looking at the watching, and then to make sure that things go right and there's no crisis at all.
Right. Lizold, of course, Sierra Leone is watching. Not only Sierra Leone, ECOWAS is watching as well. The African Union is watching as well the development in Liberia. How do you see Liberia moving beyond this complicated political impasse?
Yes, I think it's going to be a real challenge for Liberia. And of course, the ECOWAS intervention is positive. ECOWAS has a much better track record in intervening in crisis. We saw Ellen Johnson Sirleaf herself going to Gambia earlier in the year to solve the crisis there. So hopefully this intervention and the regional concern, you know, will help Liberia to move forward. Of course, the chair of ECOWAS, Fonya Singbe, is also under contestation in his own country, and Alpha Conde, the AU chair from Guinea as well, in terms of, you know, the electoral process in his own country. But be that as it may, it sounds as if there is a real commitment from the region to make sure that the process doesn't degrade, and that the institutions will come up with some kind of solution so that a second round can take place speedily. I heard your earlier question about George Weah and his running mate, and I think it just shows us the complexity of the Liberian politics, and that it is impossible to make a clean break with the past, and that's why it is tricky, and it is important for some kind of stability and an institutional stability in Liberia going forward.
Right, Dr. Macharia, yes.
Yes, yeah, it's a tricky situation. It's complex, but all is not lost. I think Liberia is moving in the right direction. The fact that there are people complaining, they go to court, and the court makes a decision, right or wrong is not the issue, but they make a decision which all of them appear to agree to follow. There have been complaints, but they agree to follow what the court said. Now it's up to the commission to do the job speedily and then have a runoff, because it's simply a runoff. If the evidence shows that Brumskine should have been on the among the two, is another matter. I don't think it will be, but let them come up with their arguments and say the final ones, these are two, it's a runoff, whoever wins, wins.
Lizold, Johnson Sirleaf's term has now come to an end. Beyond the electoral process, though, what is in the tray of an incoming leader?
Yes, a lot is in the tray of the new leader. I mean, as your previous speaker said, unemployment, poverty is something like 54% according to the latest World Bank figures. There's a huge lack of proper infrastructure, energy. I mean, Liberia really hasn't had it easy in the last couple of years. Just as the country was getting on its feet again economically and politically, the Ebola crisis hit. The drop in commodity prices as well has been devastating for certain sectors of the economy. But if the political situation remains stable and there is no conflict, the security situation will improve. I mean, Liberia is also in a complex region of the continent where we see not only outside Guinea and Sierra Leone and Liberia, there are threats in the wider West Africa in terms of the Sahel and elsewhere. So the country is facing massive challenges, but if it can overcome the challenge around the politics and the elections and start continuing on the path of economic development, that really is what is needed. And I think Liberians can congratulate themselves that they've really continued after this devastating impact of Ebola and everything else that has happened to them. It's not been easy, definitely.
Well, Dr. Macharia, though, the question of national reconciliation, because Liberia has been quite torn apart in the past during the Civil War. Johnson Sirleaf did manage to keep Liberia intact with stability, with peaceful stability for the last 12 years. How challenging is it going to be for any incoming leader now?
It is going to be very challenging, and that's where the people skills of whoever comes in will count, because the ability to reach out to the losers, and the losers appear as if they'll be very bitter. Already we are hearing that there is a friction between Sirleaf Johnson and her deputy, Boakai, which is not a very good thing. So, but whoever wins has to reach out, not only to the opponent directly, but go out and assure people that all is well. And that person will also need a lot of support, international support, in order to do a good job. But I think the future is bright for Liberia. It's not all doom. In fact, these are just trying moments, and Liberia will go through it. I have no doubt about that, and it will come out very well.
Right. Fisayo, in Lagos, is it a test for democracy for a country that is coming out of a civil war, having its first democratic transition? How big a test is this?
Well, I think as they try to get into this, the new government coming in would have a lot of work to do. They would have to have a large heart and not just see it as victory for their party and for the individual that is going to win eventually. It presents a lot of opportunity for them to quickly get the sympathy of the international community and get, investments, foreign direct investment to, hasten out the development of the nation. The incoming government would have to be, accountable, open and transparent, so that, and it would have to make government inclusive so that everybody feels, look, we're part of this development and we're part of this nation. That's for me the job that is cut out for the incoming government, as the time goes on.
Right. Lizul, is this a test of democracy, because we are now drawing comparisons between what has happened in Kenya and what has happened in Liberia and moving forward for African democracies?
Yes, absolutely. I think you could sum it up in that way. It is a test for democracy, but so far the Supreme Court, even though it hasn't set a deadline, which I agree would have been suitable and preferable, the Supreme Court has now referred the issue back to the Electoral Commission, and let's see what happens. Perhaps there will be a speedy resolution to the problem, and that Liberians will have a new elected leader come January 2018.
Right. Professor Macharia, your final words on this, and we are seeing a new trend for Africa here.
It's an interesting trend. It's a reaffirmation of the democratic trend. Some of the decisions have not been good, but they are taken in stride. So it's a good trend as people learn how to take it all in and move on, and expect that the politicians, because the problem is not even the voters, it is individual politicians who choose to violate principles of democracy. So we expect that politicians in Africa, we will learn to respect not only the electoral commissions, the judiciary, to respect also other politicians like them.
All right, Professor Macharia Munene, your insights there, we appreciate. That's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Lizul Lo Vodran, Senior Research Consultant at the Institute for Security Studies, a Peace and Security Research Program. In Lagos, Fisayo Alo, Senior Researcher at the Good Governance Africa, and with me in studio, Professor Macharia Munene, an international relations expert at the USIU here in Nairobi. To you all, thank you very much for joining in on the program. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join me again next week for more Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.